So, welcome back to the Greg Kofford Books lecture series with Charles R. Harrell, author of This Is My Doctrine, The Development of Mormon Theology. Once again, my name is Brian Whitney, and I'll be moderating this discussion. This is our second installment of a four-part series with Charlie, so if you missed last week's discussion, then you can listen to it through our podcast, the Greg Kofford Books Authorcast. You can just search for the podcast through your favorite podcast player, or you can listen to it on our website at gregkofford.com. So before we get into tonight's topic, let me just give a quick announcement. We are running a church history and doctrine sale. We have select print and ebook titles for 30% off of regular price, running from now through Memorial Day. One of those books is This Is My Doctrine. Now, this is, again, it's for both print books and ebooks. So if you want to get the Kindle version of it or Apple Books version of it, then hop over to Amazon or the Apple Bookstore, and you'll get the 30% off through those retailers. Also, due to popular demand, we've extended our sale on our Book of Mormon themed print titles through Memorial Day as well. This is not an ebook sale on these. This is for only print titles. You can check out these sales, get more information at our website, gregkofford.com, rather. So let's go ahead and get into the discussion. I know we've got a lot of people out there that have been anxiously awaiting for tonight. So last week, we discussed the nature of doctrine. We talked about how doctrinal uniformity just doesn't seem to hold up historically. We discussed infallibility, assumptions about infallibility. And we also talked about how the development of theology is by nature largely an exercise in proof texting scriptures and past traditions, and that this is just how doctrine develops. Wasn't necessarily a negative thing, right? It was just more of an observation that this is how doctrine works. So building from this basis, tonight we're going to be digging into Joseph Smith's ideas around restoration, and we're going to be discussing and examining the concept of restoration from a biblical perspective. Now, this discussion tonight is mostly derived from chapter 3 of This Is My Doctrine. And just a reminder that This Is My Doctrine is on sale right now for 30% off either print or ebook. You can learn more at our website, gregkofford.com. Last week, we had some great questions and comments from our viewers. So we'd like to invite you to participate again. If you're watching us, if you hung out long enough for us to get our act together tonight, then please participate again and post those questions. We really enjoyed hearing from you. It's great to have you back and be able to hear you. You ready to dig in, Charlie?
I think so. Sorry for the delay.
All right. So let's go ahead and just start with a hardball question then. So was the restoration of the gospel actually prophesied in the Bible?
That's a great question. And I want to say, first of all, that there are actually 3 chapters in the book that are devoted to the restoration of the gospel, the priesthood, the church. So this particular chapter 3 is focused on the restoration of the gospel in general. And was that prophesied in the Bible? The simple answer is no. And this becomes evident when one understands the nature of biblical prophecy, and also when one starts reading and studying these prophecies within the historical context in which they were given. Regarding the nature of prophecy, most serious Bible scholars today maintain that biblical prophets did not see events, especially specific events, far ahead into the future, much less in a different far-off country and place in the world. They maintain that prophets were more forthtellers than foretellers, talking about events in their own day, warning the people of the consequences of sin and what would happen if they failed to repent. So any prediction of the future was sort of conditional and imminent based on the behavior of the people. So in this sense, really ancient prophets were much like the way the current LDS prophet is seen today. We wouldn't expect to see President Nelson talk of events several millennia into the future, or centuries, or even several years into the future. What he focuses on is today's situation and how to make the saints better and how to prepare them for whatever is coming ahead. So it's interesting that for some reason we've been conditioned to expect more of ancient prophets than we would from our own living prophet. So the other aspect of the answer is the examination of these prophecies within the historical context in which they were given. And virtually all of these prophecies in the Bible, and I cover some 20 or so in the chapters on the restoration, these prophecies and many of these passages were not prophecies at all, by the way. They are actually proof texts for the latter-day restoration of the gospel. When examined in their historical context, we discover that they had meanings that were entirely different than what are typically assumed.
Sorry, I was muted.
Okay, I was hoping that
we're going back to the audio issues. So on that note, I mean, clearly the concept of some sort of restoration is discussed in the New Testament texts and in the Old Testament as well. So can you give us some idea of what the writers, the New Testament writers, or even some of the Old Testament writers might have meant by that?
Yeah, good point. They didn't talk about a restoration. It just wasn't a restoration of the gospel or the priesthood or the church. In the Old Testament, the restoration spoken of was the restoration of the house of Israel to their promised lands, and a reestablishment of their kingdom with the promise that it would be more glorious than even it was in the beginning, with a new heaven and a new earth. The New Testament continues that same theme of restoration, talking about the restoration of Israel, but it also mentions this mysterious restoration of all things in Acts 3:19-21. It states that there will be a restitution or restoration of all things spoken of by all the holy prophets since the world began. Peter, in giving this statement pronouncement, he alludes to Moses then as one of these prophets. And it's interesting that what he says about what Moses said was that a prophet would arise like unto him, and he would redeem the world from sin, of course, referring to Christ. So notice that the reference isn't to some kind of a latter-day gospel restoration, but to a restoration of all things from sin, or from the ravages of sin. Peter further explains that this restoration would coincide with the second coming, which he expected to occur in what it says in verse 24, in these, or Peter's days, or is rendered in the New English Bible, in this present time. So it's interesting, this reaffirms the New Testament notion that the second coming was expected to occur within their lifetime, and they expected Christ to come and gather all things in one and wrap up all things. So this was the restoration of all things spoken of by all the holy prophets, according to Peter.
Right, and of course, this would have been written during a time that would make sense, as you see tension between Jerusalem and Rome, and you see attacks on Christians from both Romans and from Jewish leaders, it would make sense at this time that you would think that this is going to be the last days for them, right?
Right. That was the expectation.
But I mean, if there's anything that we know about religious traditions, it's that they are very good at taking these types of passages and likening them to themselves, all throughout history, right? And there's a long running joke that I think is fairly accurate, that one thing that every generation, or two things rather, that every generation of Christians has in common is that they all think that it's the last days, and they're all wrong. So we're experiencing that today, right? But on that note, how is the restoration of all things that you were mentioning from Acts 3 interpreted within Mormonism?
Yeah, there were essentially, today in Mormonism, it's viewed, of course, as the restoration of all things, including the gospel, priesthood, church structure. That's how it's generally used. But this wasn't always the case. And the historical use of this passage is a good example of the evolution of scriptural interpretation, like many other scriptures that are used to support Mormon doctrines. This passage is also a good example of how interpretation tends to take on understandings that are common at the time.
So I was just going to jump over here to our viewer comments and see if anybody's posted anything yet about this. And I don't see any questions about this topic so far that we've had, but David Bannock is on with us, and I'm glad that you can hear us finally. And again, we apologize for the delay. Riley Oslin gave us a woohoo that he can hear us. So good to hear, good to see you guys on there. If we have other viewers that are with us, and if you would like to post any questions as we go along for Charles, then I'll be stopping periodically to read those. But let's keep going with this concept of restoration of all things, and maybe broaden it out a little bit. We talked about maybe how it was seen and interpreted within Mormonism, but let's put it into its historical context in the broader Second Great Awakening, and particularly the primitive Christian movement. If viewers aren't familiar with the term, the primitive Christian movement, maybe you can just define that real quick before we go on.
Okay. Yeah, it was a movement that was really active at the time of Joseph Smith, where individuals, Alexander Campbell and others, were trying to return to what Campbell called the ancient order of things that they expected to be restored. So these churches were seeking a restoration of primitive Christianity, in essence. And they all contended that the church should be called after Jesus Christ, if it was his church. And they contended for many of the things that we find in the Mormon church as it got established. But this idea, this primitivist view of the restoration of all things, and by the way, Acts 3 was one of the passages that they used to justify this return to the primitive gospel of Christ, primitive church. And this started clear back in the days of the early Reformation period, when radical reformers such as Anabaptists started rising up and saying that a reformation wasn't enough, that what was needed was a complete return to the primitive church as was taught by Christ. And they started basing that and using as a proof text for this need for a total restoration, Acts 3, which talks about a restoration of all things. And all things, of course, is broad enough and vague enough that it could be applied to just about anything you would want it to, except for when you read it within its entire context. So if I could, there were two other views of the restoration of all things that were in circulation at the time. The traditional view was the way that most theologians would see it today, even, which is a restoration of all creation, all things, meaning all things that there are through Christ's redemption, that they would all be gathered together in one. So this was the traditional view, but that raised questions in the minds of many with respect to what about the wicked? Are they going to be restored as well? And so beginning back in the days of Origen in the 3rd century, there was a belief that we're going to take all things literally and assume that it refers to everybody eventually being saved. This was the beginning then of Universalism, which was very popular and growing at the time of Joseph Smith. The argument was that the restoration of all things spoken of by the Apostle Peter refers to everything, nothing excluded. So they felt that everybody would be saved, whereas the traditional view just assumed that was implicit, that the wicked would be excluded from that restoration.
So it turned into a question of between a couple of theological ideas such as Calvinism and Universalism that was growing at the time. Restoration became a question of ultimate salvation for the individual, it sounds like.
Yes, that was very controversial at the time. So you have the seekers and the primitivists who were using restoration of all things to justify a return of ancient Christianity, primitive Christianity. But that was a minority group compared to this battle that was going back and forth between Universalists and traditional Protestants who were saying that, no, not everybody's going to be saved, only the righteous, and you are taking Acts 3 out of context to assume that that refers to the salvation of everyone.
Gotcha. And how would have Joseph Smith understood this expression? I mean, I think it's fairly well known that he was a Christian primitivist, but he also had kind of his own take on Christian primitivism.
Right, and he certainly would have been exposed to these views because of the heated controversies around Universalism, as well as the primitivist movement. So I think he had come across these different interpretations of Acts 3, but we can see his development of the use of this phrase, restoration of all things, throughout his ministry or lifetime, beginning with the Book of Mormon.
So why don't we go ahead and talk about some of the interpretive history that we find in the Book of Mormon.
Okay, so looking at the Book of Mormon, to begin with, I think it's important to point out that the Book of Mormon does not say anything about a restoration of the church or priesthood in the latter days. It does, however, speak of the restoration of the house of Israel, but primarily through the instrumentality of the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Mormon and in early Mormonism, Joseph Smith is seen as the translator, the seer, not the prophet of the restoration. And early revelations, in fact, even speak of any church being acceptable as long as it's founded on the gospel, which the Book of Mormon defines as faith, repentance, baptism, and the gift of the Holy Ghost, and sometimes enduring to the end. But the Book of Mormon also, interestingly, interprets the restoration of all things spoken of by the Apostle Peter. But it does so with an anti-universalist subtext. So in this case, Alma is the anti-universalist or the traditional Protestant, and his son Corianton is the universalist who thinks and believes that in the end, everyone will be restored to holiness and happiness. So I'm going to look at an excerpt here from the book that says that the prophet Alma makes reference twice. It's interesting, twice he mentions the restoration of all things which has been spoken by the mouth of the prophets. So undeniably, that's a reference to the passage in Peter. It's the only place in the scriptures that mentions anything about a restoration of all things spoken of by the prophets. Then he states that some have wrested the scriptures, supposing this restoration to mean that all men would be restored at Judgment Day from sin to happiness. Then Alma explains that what it really means is that all things will be restored to their proper order. For the righteous, it means being restored to righteousness and happiness, while for the wicked, it means being restored to evil and endless misery. Now, this argument that he presents to Corianton just happens to be a common anti-universalist argument used in Joseph Smith's day. In the book, I refer to the anti-universalist article published in an 1805 evangelical magazine that repudiates universalism and states, quote, "The restitution of all things which God hath spoken by the mouth of his holy prophets," unquote, should be understood to mean, quote, "things will all be then restored to order, and every creature will have his proper place assigned to him." So that is essentially the same argument that Alma's using with his son Corianton to repudiate the universalist view. This is also a good illustration, by the way, of how the Book of Mormon really mirrors 19th century religious discourse, and not just the language and terminology, but the very arguments and positions itself. So I think that's something that for me was very enlightening in doing the book, was to discover that I could learn an awful lot about the Book of Mormon theology and doctrinal discourse by understanding the sermons and discourses that were current in Joseph Smith's day. So that's the Book of Mormon understanding of the restoration of all things. It's couched in a universalist, anti-universalist debate. After the publication of the Book of Mormon, though, the restoration of all things began to be used more in the traditional sense of a restoration of all things from sin at the second coming, or a return of the earth to its paradisiacal state. This view was taught by Joseph Smith and his associates up to at least 1840. In fact, as late as 1842, I include this quote from the Millennium, an article called The Millennium in the Times and Season, which states, quote, "When we speak of the great restitution of all things spoken of by the mouth of the holy prophets since the world began, we mean to be understood that wherein the earth has been changed in the least from its primeval state, it will be restored and the curse taken away." So up to this time, the idea or the use of the restoration of all things as in more of a primitivist view was not taken, but it was moving in that direction, and it began in 1840, where Joseph Smith spoke exclusively in terms of the restoration of the church and the priesthood and its ordinances when referring to the restoration of all things. In fact, he even went so far as to state that it would entail the restoration of animal sacrifices that were practiced anciently, because all things had to be restored. So from that point, Acts 3 became a popular proof text, of course, in Mormonism for the restoration of the gospel, the church, the priesthood. And this is generally the way and the only way that Acts 3 is interpreted in sermons in the church. And this is was made clear in the recent General Conference, where there were 3 talks that referred to the restoration of all things in the sense of the restoration of the gospel. In fact, the new proclamation on the restoration leads with this passage to emphasize the restoration of the gospel.
And I want to go back a little bit and talk about some comments that you made about the anti-universalism that we find in the Book of Mormon that seem to mirror the 19th century conversation between sort of evangelical and universalist camps. And I'm going to refer to Reverend Dr. Dale Luffman for a second, who recently passed away. So our condolences to his family. But he wrote a pretty significant book titled, it was the Book of Mormon's Witness to its First Readers. And in it, he talks about this concept that the Book of Mormon seemed to be an apologetic of sorts that was defending, I guess you would say, an evangelical view of the Bible, or a literal view of the Bible, against things like universalism, Unitarianism, deism, and this religious skepticism that was prevalent during Joseph Smith's time. So do you have any comments on that before we, and I'm just kind of doing this to see if we can get any more people hopping on the stream.
Yes, I think that's an excellent observation that I would concur with, and it's especially anti-universalist. There are many passages that refer to the fact that there will be a punishment in the afterlife for the wicked, that it will be an eternal, endless punishment. So very strong in its opposition to any idea that the wicked will be redeemed and restored to happiness and holiness, even after some suffering. So where Nephi talks about the wicked being punished with a few stripes and then ultimately saved, any even mild universalism was rejected in the Book of Mormon.
We also, before we cut out, we had some pretty interesting comments by Cheryl Bruno as well. And Cheryl, as you know, yeah, she's publishing a book with us along with Joe Steve Swick that looks at the history of Freemasonry and Mormonism in a pretty in-depth way, and I think really showing that Masonic ideas permeated Joseph Smith's environment and his social environment, and so she's drawing a connection, and I'm going to let her repost her comments on here so that I don't get them wrong. But she drew a connection between Freemasonry's view of restoration, which is still a little bit different than the ones that you've discussed, as well as dispensationalism. So we're going to wait for those comments. That's a teaser. Wait for her to post her comments again, and maybe we can chat about those. But let's go ahead and continue forward. You were mentioning before we cut out the recent proclamation on restoration that was given at this last general conference. So this is a pretty timely topic. And I want to go back and revisit what you were saying about the proclamation of restoration. You mentioned how it opened up, kind of the first words in it that reaffirmed this very Mormon view of restorationism. Can you elaborate a little bit, dig into that?
Yeah, again, I think with the exception of some scholarly articles that you see published about the restoration of all things in Acts, it's virtually universally understood as being a restoration of the church and the gospel and priesthood and everything associated with it. But another interesting trend in recent times, especially with the presidency of Russell M. Nelson, is the concept of an ongoing restoration, that the restoration is still ongoing. And that's something that has been taught from early on, but it's always been taught with the idea that it's not completed yet, that there's still additional powers and maybe even ordinances that are to be restored to complete the restoration of all things. Animal sacrifice is one that I guess there may still be an expectation for by some, since it was prophesied by Joseph Smith, or stated that that was necessary. But in recent times, the ongoing restoration idea has taken on a completely different view of restoration as an implementation of sorts of policies, of meeting changes, things that were not originally associated with the concept of priesthood restoration and restoration of ordinances. In fact, now we're talking about things that are fairly insignificant, or I don't want to say trivial, but they're not ancient rites or practices that we are returning to. They're just an implementation of new procedures and policies to accommodate new times and changing situations. So what we're seeing is essentially another stage in the evolution of the doctrine of restoration itself.
So that's really interesting, because I think that most Latter-day Saints would view policy changes as being sort of evidence of continual revelation, right? Continuing revelation. So it's interesting that we're starting to hear terminology around continuing revelation being merged together with an idea of that is restoration.
Yeah. So we believe that we've always taught ongoing revelation, but now the word revelation is being replaced with restoration. And we still keep the other, but we've applied it to the restoration itself, which is very interesting, I think.
Yeah, it is, particularly when you consider revelation is ongoing. Revelation would be, somewhat of a progressive type thing, and I don't mean progressive as in liberal. I mean progressive as in something that speaks to the current times, that is flexible, modifiable based on the current needs. Restoration seems to give you this sense of calling back to something, right? Pulling back some sort of ancient truth and bringing it once again into the current practice.
Right.
That is interesting. Interesting how those are being merged. Now, a couple of other ideas that I had, and Cheryl posted some comments here, and I'm going to get to those. And also we have a hello from Colorado from Carissa Cooper. Nice to see you, Carissa. Another couple of ideas that I had is that, so an idea of restoration also during the Second Great Awakening, for many of the Christian Primitivists, also was around this idea of reclaiming the spiritual gifts, right? So we're talking about gifts of healing, gifts of speaking in tongues, glossolalia, gifts of prophecy, and in this case it would have been actual prophecy of future events, and also proclaiming the gospel, and these sort of charismatic type of concepts that are also found in Acts, right, and in the writings of Paul. speaking of the spiritual gifts. And so it seems like a lot of the Restoration movement, the Campbellites, those who are doing the large revival camp meetings, they were claiming that the Spirit was once again the Spirit of Pentecost, right, was once again present on the earth. That this was their concept of restoration, and that seems to have held true also for some of the earliest converts to Mormonism. The Rigdonite group that merged with Joseph's followers in Ohio, they seem to have largely come out of this sort of, loosely speaking, this Pentecostal experience, right? And I'm not talking about Pentecostalism, but just this Pentecostal experience of charismatic gifts.
Right. That was one of the problems that Rigdon, in fact, had with the Baptist church that he belonged to, with the Campbellite movement.
Yeah, right.
He didn't see these gifts, and they weren't emphasized as much.
Right. So for these saints' experience in Ohio, in particular, say around the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, the spiritual manifestations that people were experiencing, we see a lot of documentation of healing, of tongue speaking, of all of these sort of charismatic events happening at that time in 1835, 1836 within the church. At some point, this begins to shift towards authority, towards ecclesiastical authority and priesthood. Have you been able to discern this shift and sort of maybe what Rigdon's role versus Joseph's role was in shifting this conversation from charismatic over to authoritative restoration?
It's a very interesting observation, and I'm not aware of the exact time when that shift took place, but I have a good friend, Chris Thomas, who is a Pentecostal, and he's also the president of the Book of Mormon Studies Association, and has done a lot of research on the Book of Mormon and the teachings of the Book of Mormon. And one of the things that he noted when he started reading getting into the Book of Mormon and hearing about early Mormonism was that it sounded an awful lot like Pentecostalism. And yet, when he comes out to Salt Lake and visits an LDS service, he wonders, where's all the gifts? Where's this charismatic display that was professed in the early church? So there has been a dramatic shift since early times. Exactly when that shift started taking place, obviously it was sometime after the Kirtland period, and probably still during the leadership of Joseph Smith. But that's a real good question, though, and I'm sure somebody has traced that evolution.
I saw Brent Metcalf was on our live stream before when we had to kill it. I don't know if he was able to hop back on, but I bet Brent Metcalf probably has an idea around this. Some of my feelings is when there was the massive apostasies going on during the Kirtland period, particularly with what was going on with Missouri, and you had key figures of the church who were leaving, witnesses to the Book of Mormon who were leaving and being excommunicated for various reasons. It seems that at this point, and also just with the troubles in Missouri, period, with what I would consider to be a civil war in Missouri, it seems that there is a shift that is pretty noticeable at this point, right? It seems to almost go hand in hand with militant, kind of a militant direction as well. Sorry, I mean, and it would kind of make sense that authoritativeness and militancy would sort of emerge at the same time. But anyway, that's speculation.
Yes, and in fact, almost every charismatic faith at the time had a problem reining in these charismatic experiences, because people were, even in the Kirtland era, they were professing visions, revelations, spirits were leading people off cliffs, and it was just getting way out of control. So I imagine a lot of that shift involved an effort to rein in some of the radical manifestations of these spiritual expressions.
Yeah, we definitely see that. So I'm going to go ahead and go to our viewer comments. So let's read through some of Cheryl's, because I think they were interesting and relevant, and another way of looking at the concept of restoration. She said it's interesting to her that the Masons considered ancient prophets like Adam, Enoch, Moses, etc., as grand masters who dispensed the true masonry to the earth. And she likens this to the Mormon view of dispensationalism and restorationism. Now, I'm going to stop there for a quick second, because I think dispensationalism is something that we weren't necessarily planning to talk about in this episode, and I actually in any of our episodes, but I think it is relevant to this conversation. So can you give us a little bit of your ideas and understanding about the concept of dispensationalism?
Okay, and that's an interesting observation by Cheryl. I think there were periods of time that you've got this hermetic, the kind of the occult Jewish Kabbalah, these mystical side of it that saw, I think, the history of Judaism and the Lord's dealing with his children in a way that was a little different than the traditional view. But this idea of dispensationalism, you see threads of that down through history, and it came in modern times through John Nelson Darby, who even as early as the time of Joseph Smith was advocating the notion of dispensations, and even of 7 dispensations existing. And Mormonism picked up on that idea, the notion of 7 dispensations and even more, of course, with the Book of Mormon. But that was another passage that I talk about in chapter 3, which is Ephesians 1:10, I think it is, about where Paul, who allegedly wrote the book of Ephesians, talks about the dispensation of the fullness of times. And Mormonism has kind of interpreted that and understood it as being a period of time, and there being 7 of these major periods throughout the history of the earth, when in fact Ephesians is only talking about, or the letter to the Ephesians is only referring to the concept of the gospel dispensation, or the dispensation of grace, the dispensation of Christ. This was the dispensation that Paul was preaching, in contrast to the dispensation of Moses, or the law, which was done away in Christ. But we have taken that and fashioned it into this elaborate periodic system of times when the gospel was dispensed from God to humans on earth. So, but the idea that Masons saw that as a form of dispensationalism, or described it in that fashion, is very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's important for viewers to understand that dispensationalism as a concept is not something that's shared within the broader Christian community, right? This isn't, and I think that if you grow up as a Latter-day Saint, it's something that you assume that is a common feature from most Christian traditions, that they would think of these dispensations of time being, from Noah, from Adam to Noah, from Noah to Solomon or David. I couldn't even name all the seven dispensations, but up to Jesus Christ and the meridian of time, right? We would think that this is pretty standard biblical teaching, but in fact, it's really not.
Yes, it's not biblical at all. It's not even in the Book of Mormon. It's something that was adapted from, I believe, the Restorationist movement and Christian Primitivism and the influence of people like Darby.
Yeah, right. And as Cheryl points out, quite possibly conversations that were going on within Freemasonry as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting connection.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go to another comment here from David Bannock. He says, "Oh, and this is kind of a clever comment, David. A true restoration to the first century Christian movement would be house churches. They didn't have official buildings to meet for centuries. With COVID raging, we might end up with small house churches again. Ongoing restoration. There will be significant changes when we meet again, however we meet." I'm going to answer real quick here, and I mean I think it's a clever way to look at things. Yeah, I am actually a huge fan of house church, and I'm not necessarily talking within a Latter-day Saint context either. That how the idea of house church has actually been a trend for quite a while. I mean, really, we had, even in the 1960s, Jesus movement within evangelical Christianity, house churches and small group churches were springing up all over the place. This idea of church being outside of one large organized institution with hierarchy, and the idea of it being separate, smaller groups that are loosely affiliated is a concept that evangelical Christians have been doing for a long time. Now we're starting to see it around, but you're absolutely right. In the first century, people met together in secret, usually, and they met together in homes, usually after the Jewish Sabbath, if you were in a Jewish community, and you had a literal meal together. And you would observe things like, what we call the communion now, or Eucharist, or the sacrament. They would perform those things together, but it was an actual get together meal, which right now we can't even have. But anyway. Any ideas? Any comment on that, Charlie?
Oh, that's an interesting comment. Something you would expect from Dave to present, but it does also illustrate a fallacy with this primitivist idea of restoration back to the early church, because historians of early Christianity would say that there was no early church. Christ never organized a church. He called 12 apostles, sent them forth. He called 70 and sent them forth to preach the gospel. But in the early church, in the apostolic church, in the apostolic period, there was no office of 70. The only offices in the church were apostle, elder or bishop, they were synonymous terms, and deacon. All the other offices that we have today, priest, high priest, 70, patriarch, those are callings or offices that can't be found in the early Christian church. I know Joseph Smith said that an evangelist is a patriarch, but that's just unsupported. So when we talk about returning or restoring the primitive church of Christ, we don't even really know what that means. And it certainly doesn't mean what the church organization is today in Mormonism, because there were no stakes, wards, there was no temple worship, there was no celestial marriage or endowments that were present in the early Christian church. That's all, those are things that weren't restored, they were created, invented in our day.
Yeah, even the distinction of a Melchizedek and an Aaronic priesthood wasn't something
Right,
that
there
would
was
have been
no
recognized
priesthood.
to a New Testament
Yeah, there was
era,
no
an
Aaronic
apostolic age,
priesthood.
right?
Right.
But it is something, going back to Cheryl's comment again, that was something that was an organizational distinction within Masonry.
That's right.
Um,
That's right. I believe they recognized that division of priesthood, Aaronic, Melchizedek, higher, lower priesthood.
right.
So there were. Mhm.
Cheryl also responded about Darby. She said, though Darby is considered the father of modern dispensationalism, he wrote about it later than when it was seen
He did.
in Freemasonry.
Yep.
So very interesting. Seeing if there's any other comments from viewers. If not, then I think we're probably going to go ahead and wrap this one up. It has been, again, we apologize, a bit of a messy one this week with audio issues and with having to jump back in. But I think that we still ended up with a good discussion. I am going to patch these two live streams together into one episode through our podcast. So if a person didn't make it through the rest of this, then they can listen to it in its entirety through the Greg Kofford Books author casts. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this discussion. And once again, would like to thank Charlie Harrell for taking the time to be our guest during this lecture series. And just a reminder, we do have a selection of Latter-day Saint history and doctrine books on sale right now, both in print and ebook format. The sale is running through Memorial Day, and you can learn more about that at our website, gregkofford.com. Charlie's book, This Is My Doctrine, is part of that sale, so be sure to pick it up. And also, we have extended our sale on Book of Mormon related print titles. We had that running for quite a while. It's been popular, so we've decided to go ahead and extend that to Memorial Day as well. Be sure to join us next week. We're going to try this again next week. And we'll see if we can get this in one stream and see if we can get the audio working. Maybe we'll jump on a little early to see if we can make sure audio is working fine. But we're going to discuss the evolving theology of Godhood of the Godhead, rather, in Mormonism. And again, if you came into this lecture late, if you lost us on the first stream and didn't jump back into the next stream, then be sure to check out the podcast. I'll probably have it posted sometime tomorrow on the Greg Kofford Books Authorcast. You can subscribe to that through your whatever podcasts app you use, whether it's Apple Podcasts. We're on Spotify now, so you can check it out through those, or you can just listen to it right on our website at gregkofford.com. So once again, thanks, Charlie, and we will look forward to seeing you next week.
Okay, I appreciate everybody hanging on that still is on, and we'll see you next week.
All right, take care.